All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Each little flower that opens, each little bird that sings, He made their glowing colours, He made their tiny wings. All things bright and beautiful. It's an Anglican children's hymn. I went to an Anglican boys' school in the 1950s and early 1960s, and the only way I could have avoided singing that song was premature death. Actually, it's sort of the anthem of a scientific movement called Natural Theology, what we'd call a scientific research program today. Natural theology aimed to prove the power, the wisdom, the benevolence of a supernatural creator by the evidence of his creation, the natural world we see around us. But strangely enough, it also laid the basis for the triumph of Darwinian materialism in the biological sciences. And that's an outcome that the devout Christians who initiated the program would scarcely have imagined. The song, All Things Bright and Beautiful, wasn't written until 1848, at a time when natural theology had about 10 years left to run before it sailed onto the rocks of truth and sank forever. There was originally a second notorious, quite sinister verse to the song that they don't sing anymore, but I'll tell you about that later because I'm getting ahead of the story. Now, the natural theology movement began in the mid-1600s, the 17th century, at a time when the astronomer Galileo was under permanent house arrest for advocating that the Earth moved around the Sun, and most educated people believed that the world was just 6,000 years old. This is the spot. We'll park up ahead here and take a walk down the ridge line. Open door for dog. Are you ready? When we step out into the natural world today, to go birdwatching, for example, we rely on identification books like this or smartphone apps that will help us identify exactly the creature or plant we're seeing. These guides give us, for each plant or creature, a common name and, more importantly, a unique, globally recognised scientific name in Latin. And they group these organisms according to their relationship by evolutionary descent. Birds of prey, hawks, eagles, falcons, and so on, are, for example, all grouped together. This system is the foundation of the biological sciences. So how did that come about? It's a story about groundbreaking science initiated by the Natural Theology movement and unexpected consequences. And it begins with a paradigm of God. Now, the version of God that prevailed in the 1600s, had in fact prevailed for centuries, was the personal God. The wise old white guy with the white beard and the long hair, who knew everything and had designed and created the whole shebang in 6 days. He was easy to relate to because he was recognisably human, even if he was a somewhat distant, stern and humorless patrician. He had, after all, according to the Bible, created humans in his image, so it was easy to imagine what he looked like. Today, the personal God is almost entirely depicted by cartoonists. But back in the 17th century, he was taken very seriously and very literally indeed. He was frequently depicted in religious art, and his most famous portrait, the one everyone knows, was painted by Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel more than a century before this story begins. When people prayed, this was their vision of God. All stories have a backstory, but for simplicity, let's begin in 1627 in the little English village of Blacknotley with the birth in humble circumstances of John Ray, a man often called the founder of natural history. His mother was the local herbalist, his father the village blacksmith. Ray got his fascination with nature from his mother, whom he accompanied on the rounds of the fields and lanes collecting the medicinal plants she dispensed to the sick. His father's job was probably formative too. Blacksmiths were the general purpose metal technicians of their day. They made and repaired many necessities. Simple things like nails, horseshoes and chains, but also more complex objects. Ploughs, furniture, gates, cooking utensils and weapons. As a young boy, Ray would have spent hours in the forge watching his father at work, and this experience probably developed in him an interest in how things were put together, how they functioned. To the great good fortune of what we now call science, experimental philosophy as it was then known, a local clergyman recognised Ray's talents and he was accepted by Cambridge University when he was 16. These were the terrible years of the English Civil War between the forces of Parliament and the Crown, a war in which around 10% of the population died. The Bible was virtually the only source of ideological authority, and both sides, and the factions on the parliamentary side, sought biblical authority for their politics and quoted scripture to their purpose. But Ray immersed himself in his studies, and in 1649, the year Oliver Cromwell abolished the monarchy, he embarked on an academic career, lecturing in Greek, mathematics and humanities. On the side, He was a nature enthusiast. He also preached in the Trinity College Chapel, and the title of one of his sermons, "The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation," pretty much sums up the grand natural history research program that was to dominate the next century and a half. In 1660, the year the monarchy was restored, Ray became a minister of the Anglican Church. This is going to be a very Anglican story. He was then at the apogee of a conventional academic career, but 2 years later his career, and his hopes of a church role, came crashing down. In that year, on the grounds of conscience, Ray was unable to subscribe, as required, to the Act of Uniformity, Charles II's sweeping totalitarian ordinance intended to enforce absolute conformity to the state religion. Along with over 2,000 other clergymen, Ray was expelled from the church and denied a role in the university or any part in public affairs. Fortunately, a former Cambridge student and fellow nature enthusiast, Francis Willoughby, who was independently wealthy, came to the rescue as Ray's patron and co-worker. Science was the winner. Back then, the church encouraged believers to approach the living world with a sense of wonder. It was widely considered impertinent, even dangerous, to look too closely at how God's creation actually worked. That was a stricture Ray and Willoughby didn't take too seriously. Ray wrote that he was immensely grateful to God, that he'd been born in an age of noble discovery, when the secrets of nature were being unsealed and explored. Underwriting the research program was this: hitherto, knowledge of God and his wishes had relied on an endless reinterpretation of the Bible, something known as revealed theology. For 1600 years, this had led to futile disputation, schism, violence and war. But what if one could get into the mind of God independently of the book? What if you could comprehend his wisdom, power and benevolence by a study of the world he'd created? What could possibly be wrong with that approach? First, Ray and Willoughby had to overcome a huge problem. Even common species of plants and animals were known by different names in different places, even a few kilometres apart. Some quite different species were known by the same name, and many, in fact as we now know, the vast majority, had no name at all. Ray wrote, "When men do not know the names and properties of natural objects and are ready to believe any fanciful superstition about them, they cannot see and record accurately." In other words, without a systematic, universally accepted catalogue of nature's treasures, a way anyone, anywhere, could definitively tell one plant or creature from another, it was impossible to cut through ignorance and confusion to reveal God's underlying plan. Their catalogue would, for the first time, order animals on the basis of anatomical similarity. Obvious to us now, but 360 years ago, it was a revolutionary concept. Now in 1660, a couple of years before Ray was bundled out of his job at Cambridge, the Royal Society, which is still one of the world's premier scientific societies, was founded. Willoughby was a founding member, and Ray was elected a Fellow in 1667. In the midst of the brutal suppression of religious freedom following the Restoration, there was great enthusiasm among educated men for the new experimental philosophy that Ray and Willoughby were pursuing, and Charles II was shrewd enough to pick up on it. After a divisive war and the turmoil and instability that followed, it was a way former opponents could come together on neutral ground. At its meetings, it was forbidden to talk about religion or politics, and certainly not the war. But getting into the mind of God by way of the new experimental philosophy was fine. Ray and Willoughby travelled widely. Their first research trip was to the west coast of England to study breeding seabirds. Then they spent 3 years travelling across Europe, collecting specimens and whatever data they could acquire from European collectors. In this partnership, Ray was very much the botanist and Willoughby the bird, fish and insect enthusiast. Alas, in 1672, in the midst of the preparation of a groundbreaking series of books on natural history, Willoughby died of pleurisy. He was just 36. 4 years later, Ray published in Latin Willoughby's bird book, Ornithologiae. An edition in English followed. It was a groundbreaking work, the first systematic scientific work of ornithology, the forerunner of all of today's bird ID guides. It even had pretty good illustrations, the considerable expense for which was met by Willoughby's wife. John Ray was the first person to provide a biological definition of species. Plants and animals, he wrote, that differ specifically preserve their distinct species permanently. One species never springs from the seed of another. And by that he meant simply that the mating of a pair of pigeons never produces a brood of swallows. Of course, Ray and Willoughby never wondered how all these distinct types of organisms had come into being, because they assumed they knew. God had created each species miraculously, in a moment. That was in the Bible. At Ray's death in 1705, there was still no simple, universally recognised system for naming all the organisms that were being collected and described. When one arrived, it was the work of a Swede, Carl von Linné, usually known by his Latin handle, Linnaeus. Linnaeus was born in 1707, a couple of years after John Ray's death. His father was a Lutheran pastor, and Linnaeus was firmly within the Natural Theology tradition. The earth's creation is the glory of God, as seen from the works of nature, he wrote. He believed the study of nature would reveal the divine order of God's creation. By 1735, Linnaeus had worked out the details of a natural classification system that would reveal that order. Following Ray and Willoughby, he based his scheme firmly on anatomical similarity. His Systema Naturae identified species by just 2 Latin names, the system we still use today. Just over there, beneath the acacias, for example, there's an eastern spinebill, a species of honeyeater. Its scientific name is Acanthorynchus tenuirostris, and it's feeding on a hairpin banksia, Banksia spinulosa. By the 10th edition of Systema Naturae in 1758, 4,400 species of animals and 7,700 plants had been classified. I doubt if Linnaeus thought that the project was close to being done and dusted, but he could have had no conception how many species there would be or how long it would take. On current, very conservative estimates, there are around 8.7 million species, and we won't be finished cataloguing them for hundreds of years. So by 1758, Linnaeus had classified maybe 0.14% of life on Earth. By the end of the 18th century, his system had triumphed and naturalists everywhere were slotting their discoveries into it. But the system inevitably raised a big theological problem. Classification by anatomical similarity virtually demanded the creation of a category of primate mammals, and humans, Homo sapiens, had to sit within it. According to the Bible, man was created in the image of God, but shoving humans into the same basket as monkeys and apes implied monkeys and apes were created in the image of God as well. To the devout, this was a very dangerous idea, because most Christian theology saw animals as soulless machines. Linnaeus tried to slip around this problem with a formula most of us today would agree with. He wrote, "Theology decrees that man has a soul, but that the animals are mere automata mechanica. But I believe they would be better advised that animals have a soul and that the difference is of nobility." What he was saying was that the difference was analogous to the continuum of social degree in his society between the labourers, peasants and artisans at the bottom and the landed aristocracy at the top. In pursuit of the great cataloguing effort, 19 of Linnaeus' students travelled the globe on voyages of discovery and exploration. And several of these young men died on their travels, but the collections of new species rolled in. Perhaps his most famous student, Daniel Solander, was the naturalist on Captain James Cook's first round-the-world voyage, and the first university-educated scientist to set foot here in Australia. He and Joseph Banks brought back to Europe the first collections of plants from Australia and the South Pacific, including plants like this burrowang, Macrozamia communis. The systematisers, Ray and Linnaeus, had provided a framework within which field naturalists could work towards the common goal of cataloguing God's creation. One of them was Gilbert White, another Anglican cleric, born in 1720, who has come down to us as England's first ecologist and the best known of the 18th century parson naturalists. There were to be an awful lot of them. He was also perhaps the earliest populariser of natural history, and I reckon he should be the patron saint of citizen science. While others contributing to the cataloguing project ranged over the known world, White worked his whole life in the small country parish around the village of Selborne in Hampshire, where he was able to discover several creatures unknown to science, including a microbat, the noctule bat, and a tiny mouse, now called the Eurasian harvest mouse. But White moved the great project beyond mere collecting, cataloguing, and then galloping off down the pike. Restricted to the parish he loved, he was impelled to observe and record his wild animals and familiar plants over time, in their interrelations, their characteristic behaviours, and their seasonal comings and goings. In doing so, he invented the bird census
and was the first English naturalist to take a detailed interest in the behaviour of wild animals, including bird migration. He was fascinated by birdsong and was able to show that several secretive, almost identical, tiny bird species could be distinguished by their song. White observed with a sharp eye, and he wrote well. In 1789, he published his letters to eminent naturalists as The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne, a book which is, quite remarkably, one of the most published books in the English language and has never been out of print. White doesn't labour the glory of God's creation stuff. In the Natural History of Selborne, you won't find long didactic passages of praise for the deity, just occasional, almost ritual references to providence. And that, I think, is a subtle indication of where the project was heading. Natural theology envisaged a relatively limited number of species interacting to create an ordered, harmonious world for the benefit of the humans God had created in his image. But the research program was starting to show that nature was a vastly larger, much messier, more complex beast than the cataloguers had imagined. Getting their head out of the book and studying nature at first hand, the practitioners were being nudged unconsciously by degrees through the sheer wonder of their subject towards scientific materialism. By the time Natural History of Selborne was published, a new and theologically disturbing element had entered the equation: geology. The new science was driven, legitimised in fact, by the Industrial Revolution and its growing need for minerals. It had the power of profit behind it. In 1650, meticulous biblical research by Archbishop Usher had fixed the date of creation as the 23rd of October 4004 BC, that being very properly a Sunday, a date differing little from earlier scholarly estimates. But as field research advanced, the geologists came to see that such a short timeline and the Genesis account of the 6 days of creation was preposterous. And the idea that all the present landforms resulted from the biblical flood became absolutely untenable. The whole idea of a single global catastrophe creating all present landforms was challenged by a new uniformitarian view pioneered by the Scottish geologist James Hutton, who proposed that, in principle, the landforms we saw must be attributed only to slow-moving forces acting over immense periods of time. Distinctly different rock layers were the result of gradual processes of accumulation of sediments. Mountains were the result of ancient layers of rock being heaved upwards. And what could all these fossils that geologists were discovering possibly mean? Most were of animals and plants that clearly no longer existed. Species must have come and gone in a succession of creations and destructions. Geology was showing the world to be almost unimaginably old. Now, if the world had been only 6,000 years old, miraculous creation and the fixity of species would have made sense because there simply wasn't enough time for anything else. But the new deep time meant new species could have come into existence gradually in geological terms. Those unconvinced by the biblical account began to speculate on some process whereby new species could come into existence out of older species, a phenomenon called transmutation. A combination of geology and the runaway accumulation of species data building up under the Linnaean system was pushing natural theology into crisis. In 1802, natural theology reached its apogee with the publication of William Paley's immensely influential Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity collected from the appearances of nature. Paley, yet another Anglican clergyman, was not himself a keen naturalist. He was a theologian, philosopher and political theorist, who, for example, supported American independence and opposed slavery. Politically, at least, the man was not a die-hard reactionary. His books were required texts at Oxford and Cambridge from the late 1780s until well into the 19th century. Charles Darwin, who was to overturn the whole miraculous creation paradigm, said he had, as a student, much admired Paley's book. Paley's codification of natural theology came in response to what was, for the English ruling class, a very scary set of social challenges. The French Revolution, ideologically underwritten by the Enlightenment, with its non-Christian, deist and rationalist ideas, had swept away the French ruling order, and the Catholic Church had been ousted as the state religion. At home, the Industrial Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars were disrupting the old rural economy and radically destabilising traditional cottage industries and Britain's class structure. Paley is best remembered nowadays for what's called the watchmaker analogy, which appears right at the start of his book. It goes like this. Suppose you're walking across a wild heath and you trip over a stone. You'd probably assume that the simple stone had been there forever, and it would be difficult to refute that. But what if you spotted a pocket watch lying on the ground? You'd naturally suppose that such a beautiful, precise, intricate mechanism could not have appeared accidentally. It must have a designer, a watchmaker. The watch is an analogy for plants and animals. It's telling, I think, that Paley dismisses the simple stone. That's the disturbing evidences from geology, straight up and out of hand, before skipping on to the evidence of the form of living things to prove the existence of God. To Paley, it was atheism to argue that the eye, for example, could have come into being by anything other than a rational, creative act. And of course, it was all for the benefit of humans created in God's image. He's very much like Voltaire's Dr. Pangloss, who insisted that all was for the best, in the best of all possible worlds. Actually, the watchmaker analogy had been around for centuries, but it was typically employed as an analogy for the movement of the planets. The Scottish philosopher David Hume had debunked the argument from design more than 20 years before Paley trotted it out, but his critique didn't get much traction until the mid-19th century. The point to grasp is that the Anglican Church, a powerful government department, a department of ideological correctness, social services, and births, deaths, and marriages, had invested heavily for a century and a half in the natural theology paradigm. evidence of nature confirms existence of personal God who created perfectly adapted, unchanging species. As with nature, so with society. That was the ideological underpinning of the social order. And now, not only the evidence accumulated by geology and the Natural Theology project itself, but also alternative paradigms coming from the continent were starting to stack up against the personal God. Which brings us to Charles Darwin. Darwin was born in 1809 into a politically progressive Whig household that tended to adhere to the dissident Unitarian sect rather than the official Anglican Church. His father, Robert, was a wealthy doctor and financier. His grandfather, Erasmus, a fashionable society doctor, a popular poet and naturalist, had also advocated an evolutionary theory, which had got him into more trouble than his erotic verses. It was intended that young Charles should follow in the family tradition and become a doctor, so he was sent to the University of Edinburgh Medical School. He was far from a model student, but he threw himself into extracurricular nature studies, learned taxidermy from a freed black slave, and came into contact with materialist radicals and the evolutionary ideas of the French Enlightenment scientist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, Lamarck is the guy who developed the first truly coherent evolutionary theory. He was a deist, not a Christian, and he believed biological evolution proceeded according to natural laws, with organisms moving from simple to complex up a ladder of progress as they adapted to their environment. His theory was materialist, but his evolutionary mechanism, the inheritance of characteristics acquired in an organism's lifetime, is perhaps not quite, but certainly almost entirely wrong. This error, as we will see, was pounced on by advocates of the fixity of species created by God to discredit the whole notion of evolution. Darwin's dad, annoyed by young Charles' neglect of his medical studies, packed him off to Cambridge to do a BA, so he could become an Anglican country parson like Gilbert White. Cambridge was much to Darwin's liking, and he quickly fell in with the leading natural theologists, men like his botany professor, John Henslow, and the geologist Adam Sedgwick. He graduated well in 1831, and then before a country parsonage could be found for him, he was offered a position on the South American expedition of HMS Beagle. Darwin was taken on as the self-funded civilian gentleman companion for Captain Robert Fitzroy, with a secondary role as naturalist. He was there in large measure to keep the captain sane. In an age where Royal Navy protocol frowned on captains even dining with their subordinate officers, Fitzroy feared the loneliness of command might drive him mad, like his captain on the first Beagle expedition, who'd lapsed into severe depression and blown his brains out. Fitzroy was a brilliant young officer and a driven perfectionist who went on to found modern meteorology. He was also a deeply conservative Tory Anglican creationist who was decades later to regret having taken Darwin along. For Darwin, the voyage, which dragged on for 5 years, 3 longer than expected, was both an adventure and a revelation. He started the voyage believing in a classic natural theology position, as codified by Paley, but that sat uncomfortably with an enthusiasm for the latest geology, where both uniformitarians and catastrophists by now accepted a great age for the Earth. His experiences on the voyage reinforced the geology and challenged his commitment to natural theology. He returned in 1836 with a massive collection of as yet uncatalogued plants, animals and geological specimens, including a treasure trove of fossils. These were parcelled out to specialists to formally describe. Darwin was the man of the hour, a celebrity in scientific circles even before his return, and the London scene he moved into included not only the leading geologists and biologists of the day, typically conservative Anglicans, but also racy Whig radicals and free thinkers like his brother Erasmus and the controversialist Harriet Martineau, who espoused a cross between radical feminism and laissez-faire economics. Within 6 months, Darwin had begun the first of a series of private notebooks on the origin of new species by other than miraculous means. By late 1838, he had the outline of his theory of evolution by natural selection. He was to sit on it, trusting only a tiny handful of confidants for the next 20 years. To understand why, you have to appreciate the fear. In general, most leading scientists now accepted that the world was very old indeed, and that the biblical 6 days of creation was at best a muddled metaphor. A popular theory, the Continentals had been decades ahead on this, was that God, in the beginning, set up natural laws to govern a goal-directed evolution, the end point and highest product of which was, literally, the white European gentleman. Having set the process running, God abstained from miraculous interventions and sort of hung out, smoking cigarettes and playing guitar, watching it all unfold. But if you were an English scientist and you believed even that scenario, which still left a role for God, you kept very quiet about it. Rolling into the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had thrown English society into turmoil. At the top, a new class of Whig industrialists and businessmen were challenging the political power of the old Tory landed aristocracy. In the middle, a new professional class was rising, and at the bottom, a vast sweated underclass was organising in trade unions, and through the Chartist movement, they were demanding the vote and sweeping parliamentary reforms. These rising classes were creating a world outlook that okayed progressive change and upward social mobility, and they were seeking a legitimising analogue for that in natural history. The problem again was that transmutation of species, evolution, even if it was goal-directed, teleological, was anathema to the Anglican establishment that saw it as an ideological attack on the authority of the Bible, upon which they thought the stability and survival of the social order depended. Like nature, intellectual life abhors a vacuum. In the early 1840s, when English society sweated through often violent social upheaval, Darwin beavered away, building up his credibility as a scientist by researching barnacles. In secret, he was developing his radically materialist version of evolution, evolution by natural selection, when, in 1844, an anonymous book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, became an overnight hit. Its secret author was Robert Chambers, the Scottish publisher of Chambers' Edinburgh Journal, a wildly popular cheap secular weekly that covered history, science and politics. It was the magazine the evangelical clergy loved to hate, and they denounced it from the pulpit with extravagant invective. Chambers' book synthesised a vast range of recent science and unfolded a developmental view of the cosmos together with progressivist evolution along lines similar to Lamarck. Chambers himself believed in God, though his God was the guy who in the beginning set up natural laws and then let things unfold. He worded his support for transmutation of species with exquisite care so as to maximise its acceptability to devout Christians. But it didn't work. The conservative Anglican divines incited the elite Oxbridge scientists into an extravagant frenzy of denunciation. They reckoned the collapse of society would follow if Vestige's evolutionary ideas prevailed. It's in the thick of this that All Things Bright and Beautiful, the anthem to natural theology, hits the hymn sheets. I mentioned the notorious second verse, the one they don't sing now. It goes like this: "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly, and ordered their estate." You can't get any clearer than that. God didn't just create the natural world, he also created the social order with its extreme class inequality. What becomes clear through the Vestiges affair is that the fear of social revolution clouded the thinking of most English scientists. By the time Vestiges appeared, they'd been consciously or unconsciously self-censoring for decades. None of them could forget the events of 1791, when the brilliant Unitarian dissenter, scientist and philosopher Joseph Priestley, the man who discovered oxygen and wrote a textbook on the history of electricity that remained standard for a century, had had his home, church and laboratory torched by an Anglican mob and had fled to America. No wonder Darwin, who by this time had decided, to his horror, that he was a real materialist, laid low. The problem with Vestiges was that Lamarck's evolutionary mechanism didn't work, and the scientists knew it. But Vestiges brought widespread discussion and acceptance of evolution to the streets. For all the Anglican establishment's hysterical denunciations, and despite the technical errors that the leading scientists pointed out, it was very well received by the public. Prince Albert, who many suspected was the author, even read it to Queen Victoria, who didn't have to worry about the reaction of the church because she was the head of it. But Darwin, still terrified of social and scientific ostracism if he went public with his natural selection theory, kept balking at publishing. Then famously, his hand was forced by his receipt from Alfred Russel Wallace, a young naturalist working in the East Indies, of a paper outlining a natural selection mechanism remarkably close to his. If he didn't publish now, he wouldn't have precedence, but he was too decent to try to steal a march on Wallace, so his confidants arranged a joint unveiling of the two men's views. The evolutionary tiger was out of the bag. Darwin threw himself into writing Origin of Species, pulling together the evidence he'd been accumulating for 20 years. Origin sold out before it hit the bookshops in late 1859, but remarkably, there was less controversy than had met Chambers' book 15 years earlier. The Tory Anglican establishment had worn themselves out in their frenzied attack on Chambers' vestiges, but had failed to dent the public's taste for some form of evolution. And in the meantime, a liberal wing, open to evolutionary ideas, had developed within the Anglican Church. Now, in the place of Lamarckism, there was a credible materialist mechanism by which new species could arise gradually out of older ones, and it came from a naturalist of great credibility. In his book, Darwin didn't explicitly discuss the origins of the human species, but the natural theologians drew the obvious conclusion. Darwin was saying that humans were descended from an ape-like ancestor. The whole thing came to a head at the 1860 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, held at Oxford. In a long and raucous session, attended by over 700 people, Bishop Samuel Soapy Sam Wilberforce championed natural theology. He was outraged by Origin of Species and went head-to-head with Darwin's men, especially the botanist Joseph Hooker and the up-and-coming Thomas Henry Huxley, later known as Darwin's bulldog, a very angry young man who was to end up a sort of secular archbishop of British science. On the day, both sides thought they'd prevailed, but the Darwinians soon emerged on top. Natural theology was on the rocks and sinking fast. Those religious folk who had felt instinctively that the personal God might be fatally wounded by delving inquisitively into the detail of his creation had been right all along. If God existed at all, he'd been on leave for a long, long time, hanging out somewhere way back in the cosmos, watching his natural laws unfold, fundamentally unknowable. Origin of Species had broken the ideological logjam. Evolution had triumphed, but ironically, most scientists still didn't accept, or fully accept, natural selection, Darwin's radically materialist mechanism. They were still looking for a mechanism that was in some reassuring way goal-directed, something implying inevitable programmed progress towards more complex, sophisticated, better adapted forms. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, when the science of genetics became reconciled with Darwinian natural selection, that Darwinian evolution finally triumphed. What remained as natural theology's achievement was the Linnaean system and the great catalogue of nature, the foundation stone of the biological sciences and an ongoing project. Ray Willoughby and Linnaeus had believed that somehow God's grand plan, in effect the mind of God, would emerge from the detail of the great catalogue. What it turned out to reveal was the material evolution of organisms over vast ages. Natural selection's problem was that it was simple and elegant, to be sure, but there was nothing socially reassuring about it. It was driven by random mutation and vast loss of life. There were no higher or lower forms. There were just organisms, unconsciously tracking their environment with more or less success. Nature can be no sure guide to ordering human society, no magic key to an ethical life. Nature just is. Staggeringly complex, fascinating, beautiful, constantly evolving. Nature hasn't been created for us, in the sense natural theology had preached. It doesn't give a damn for us, but we depend utterly on it. We evolved accidentally to be the radically self-conscious part of it. Our capacity to rapidly pass on acquired knowledge culturally makes us, as a species, either the self-limiting guardians of nature or the greatest threat to the web of life we depend on. Culture is Lamarckian. Nature is Darwinian. You know, Jesse, the great British geneticist J.B.S. Haldane was once asked by a group of Anglican divines what could be concluded about the nature of God from the nature of his creation, and he replied, "An inordinate fondness for beetles."